Have you ever found yourself surrounded by spiritual books, reading page after page about prayer and devotion, yet still feeling an emptiness inside? That moment when, despite all the knowledge you've accumulated, your heart remains untouched, your soul unquenched. You sit in your living room, shelves lined with theological volumes, spiritual guides, and devotional texts, yet something profound is missing. The disconnect between knowing about God and truly knowing God creates a void that no amount of reading seems to fill. The weight of that spiritual dryness presses down, leaving you wondering if something is wrong with your faith journey. What if I told you that the simple rosary beads, perhaps gathering dust on your nightstand or tucked away in a drawer, might hold more transformative power than every spiritual book on your shelf? This isn't about diminishing the value of spiritual reading, but rather about rediscovering an often overlooked truth that Ignatius of Loyola, the great spiritual master, understood profoundly. Sometimes the simplest prayer, engaged with the fullness of our being, can transform us more deeply than the most profound theological treatise. The Rosary represents something that goes far beyond intellectual understanding. It embodies what Ignatius recognized as a fundamental truth of authentic spirituality: that transformation happens not merely through knowledge, but through experience. When Ignatius was recovering from his battle wounds at Loyola, he initially requested chivalric romances to pass the time. Instead, he was given a life of Christ and a book about the saints. While these books certainly contained spiritual knowledge, what transformed Ignatius wasn't merely the information they contained, but how he began to experience God through reflection on what he read. Similarly, the Rosary isn't powerful because it contains some secret spiritual formula, but because it invites us into an experience of prayer that engages our whole person: mind, heart, imagination, and body. This holistic approach to prayer stands in stark contrast to our modern tendency to reduce spirituality to mere information. We live in what might be called the most information-saturated era in human history. With a few clicks, we can access virtually any spiritual text, from ancient mystical writings to contemporary theological reflections. We can read about prayer techniques, meditation methods, and spiritual pathways from traditions around the world. This abundance of spiritual information should, one might think, lead to unprecedented spiritual growth. Yet many people today experience a profound spiritual hunger alongside this feast of information. The reason for this paradox lies in what Ignatius understood so well. Spiritual transformation doesn't happen merely by accumulating knowledge about God, but by encountering God. The Rosary, in its profound simplicity, creates space for this encounter in ways that simply reading about spirituality often cannot. Consider what happens when you pray the Rosary with the kind of intentionality that Ignatius would recognize. You hold the beads in your fingers, creating a physical connection to your prayer, anchoring your often distracted mind through the sense of touch. As you move from bead to bead, you engage in the repetition of familiar prayers, words that have been spoken by countless faithful before you, connecting you to a tradition larger than yourself. But most powerfully, as you contemplate each mystery, you use what Ignatius called the application of the senses, imaginatively placing yourself within the gospel scenes, seeing the colors and faces, hearing the voices, smelling the air of Bethlehem or Golgotha, feeling the dust of Galilean roads beneath your feet. This engagement of imagination transforms prayer from an abstract mental exercise into a deeply personal encounter with the living stories of faith. This approach stands in profound contrast to how we often engage with spiritual books. When we read about prayer rather than praying, when we study spirituality rather than practicing it, we risk creating what Ignatius might call a desolation of abstraction, where God becomes a concept to be understood rather than a presence to be experienced. The Rosary pulls us out of this abstraction by engaging our senses, our imagination, and our hearts in a way that mere reading rarely does. This doesn't mean spiritual reading lacks value. Ignatius himself was transformed initially through books, but he quickly moved beyond merely reading about spiritual things to experiencing them, developing his spiritual exercises as a way to help others do the same. I want to pause here for a moment and connect with you more personally. Have you ever found yourself knowing more about prayer than actually praying? That moment when you realize you can explain contemplation to others but struggle to simply be present with God yourself? If you're nodding right now, I invite you to share in the comments with the words, "I seek prayer beyond knowledge." Your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, creating a community where we can acknowledge our common struggles on the spiritual journey. Sometimes admitting where we've substituted information for transformation is the first step toward a more authentic spirituality. The power of the Rosary within Ignatian spirituality connects deeply to what Ignatius called the principle and foundation of the spiritual life. In his spiritual exercises, Ignatius begins with this fundamental orientation that we are created to praise, reverence, and serve God, and through this to save our souls. Everything else on earth is created to help us toward this end. We should use created things insofar as they help us toward this end and free ourselves from them insofar as they hinder us. This principle reveals something profound about how we might approach spiritual books versus the Rosary. Spiritual books are created things meant to lead us toward God. But if our relationship with these books becomes an end in itself, if knowledge about God replaces relationship with God, then what was meant as a help becomes a hindrance. The Rosary, in its material simplicity, can help guard against this spiritual danger. The beads themselves hold no intrinsic value. They are merely tools to focus attention, to guide prayer, to engage the senses in service of contemplation. What matters is not the Rosary itself, but the relationship with God it facilitates. Ignatius would recognize in this the proper ordering of created things toward their ultimate purpose. The value of the Rosary lies precisely in its transparent quality, how it points beyond itself to the mysteries of faith, how it disappears into the encounter it makes possible. Many spiritual books, particularly when approached primarily for information rather than formation, lack this transparent quality. They can become endpoints rather than pathways, collections of ideas rather than invitations to encounter. This distinction becomes clearer when we consider what Ignatius understood as the difference between knowing God and knowing about God. Knowing about God involves facts, concepts, theological propositions. It's information that can be tested and measured. Knowing God, however, involves relationship, experience, personal encounter. It's transformation that can be witnessed in a changed life. The Rosary, prayed as Ignatius might guide us to pray it, facilitates this transition from information to transformation through its engagement with the narrative of salvation. As we move through the joyful, luminous, sorrowful, and glorious mysteries, we're not merely recalling facts about Jesus and Mary. We're entering into their story and allowing their story to enter into us, reshaping our understanding of our own lives in light of the greater narrative of God's love. Ignatius understood the power of this narrative engagement through his own experience. Before his conversion, he imagined himself as a character in chivalric romances, daydreaming about heroic deeds and courtly love. After encountering Christ, he began to imagine himself as a character in the gospel story, walking with Jesus, sitting at his feet, standing at the cross. This transition in his imaginative life reflected and facilitated the deeper transition happening in his soul. The Rosary invites us into a similar transition, moving from being spectators of the faith to participants in it. Each mystery becomes not merely a historical event to recall, but a present reality to enter. Not merely something that happened to Jesus and Mary, but something that happens anew in our own experience of faith. This participatory quality of the Rosary connects to another key insight from Ignatian spirituality, the call to be contemplatives in action. Ignatius never understood the spiritual life as separated from ordinary life. Prayer and daily living were not distinct realms, but interconnected realities. The contemplative experience should inform and transform action, while action creates the context and urgency for contemplation. The Rosary embodies this integration beautifully. On one hand, it invites deep contemplation of the central mysteries of faith. On the other hand, it can be prayed amid the activities of daily life, while walking, during a commute, in moments between other responsibilities. The physicality of the beads allows the prayer to accompany us through our day, creating a bridge between contemplation and action. Many spiritual books, by contrast, tend to reinforce a separation between spiritual knowledge and daily living. They must be set aside when we return to ordinary responsibilities. Their wisdom must be translated from abstract principles into concrete actions, a gap that many struggle to bridge. The Rosary collapses this gap through its integration into the rhythms of daily life. The mysteries we contemplate are not abstract theological concepts, but embodied realities of joy, light, sorrow, and glory, mirroring the full range of human experience. As we carry these mysteries with us through our day, they begin to illuminate our ordinary experiences from within, revealing God's presence in all things, another central insight of Ignatian spirituality. This ability to reveal God's presence in all things connects to what Ignatius called the general exam, a spiritual practice of reviewing one's day to notice where and how God has been present. The Rosary can function as a kind of exam through its mysteries. As we contemplate the Annunciation, we might become more attentive to moments of invitation in our own lives, times when God asks something new of us. As we pray with the crucifixion, we might recognize Christ's presence in our own suffering or in the suffering of others. The Rosary becomes not just a prayer we say, but a lens through which we see, training us in the spiritual perception that Ignatius so valued, the ability to find God in all things. Let me share a story that illustrates this transformative power. There was a theology professor, brilliant in his understanding of spiritual texts, who could lecture for hours on the nuances of contemplative prayer. He had read extensively in the spiritual classics, including the works of Ignatius. He could explain the theory of the spiritual exercises with remarkable clarity. Yet he confessed to a colleague that his own prayer life felt dry and lifeless. His knowledge had not translated into experience. At the suggestion of his colleague, he began to pray the Rosary daily, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a simple practice of presence. He allowed himself to enter imaginatively into each mystery, following the Ignatian approach of applying the senses. Within months, something shifted. The gap between his knowledge and experience began to close. The mysteries he contemplated in the Rosary began to illuminate his reading of spiritual texts, which in turn deepened his understanding of the mysteries. Knowledge and experience entered into a mutual dialogue, each enriching the other. The Rosary had become not a replacement for his spiritual reading, but a key that unlocked its transformative potential. This story highlights an important clarification. The power of the Rosary compared to spiritual books isn't about choosing one over the other, but about integrating them properly. Ignatius would never advocate abandoning spiritual reading. His own conversion began with books, and the spiritual exercises incorporate extensive meditation on scriptural texts. What Ignatius offers is a way of approaching both the Rosary and spiritual books that leads to transformation rather than mere information. The key lies in how we engage, not what we engage with. When we approach spiritual books with the same contemplative openness, the same application of imagination, the same integration of heart and mind that the Rosary facilitates, they too become pathways to encounter, rather than merely sources of information. The distinction between these approaches connects to what Ignatius described as consolation and desolation in the spiritual life. Consolation is the interior movement of the heart toward God, experienced as increasing faith, hope, and love. Desolation is the opposite movement, away from God, experienced as spiritual dryness, distraction, or distance. Ignatius observed that different activities and approaches to prayer could lead to either consolation or desolation, depending on the person and circumstances. For many in our information-saturated age, the accumulation of spiritual knowledge without corresponding experience has become a peculiar form of desolation, what might be called learned desolation, where knowing more about God paradoxically increases our sense of distance from God. The Rosary, approached with Ignatian attentiveness, often serves as an antidote to this learned desolation. Its simplicity cuts through the complexity that can become a barrier to encounter. Its physical nature grounds prayer in the body, countering the excessive abstraction of much spiritual discourse. Its narrative structure engages imagination and emotion, dimensions of our humanity often neglected in purely intellectual approaches to faith. And perhaps most importantly, its repetitive nature creates space for the kind of interior silence where God's voice can be heard beneath the noise of our own thoughts and ideas about God. This last point deserves further exploration. Ignatius placed great emphasis on silence and interior freedom as conditions for hearing God's voice. In the spiritual exercises, he instructs the retreat director to provide the exercitant with the biblical text or meditation points, then step back, allowing space for direct encounter between the person and God. Too much direction, too many words from the guide, could interfere with this essential encounter. Many spiritual books, particularly those that explain and analyze at length, can inadvertently create the same interference. Their many words about God can drown out God's own word to us. The Rosary, in its contemplative repetition of the Our Father and Hail Mary, creates a different kind of space, where words become background rhythm, clearing the foreground of consciousness for deeper listening. This insight connects to the Ignatian understanding of different kinds or levels of prayer. Ignatius recognized that prayer could be primarily discursive, involving many thoughts and considerations, or more contemplative, involving fewer concepts but deeper awareness. While both forms have their place, Ignatius generally saw growth in prayer as movement toward greater simplicity, fewer words, more direct presence. This trajectory often feels counterintuitive in our culture, which tends to equate complexity with sophistication and simplicity with naivety. We may feel that moving from complex theological texts to the simple repetitions of the Rosary represents spiritual regression rather than progression. Ignatius would challenge this assumption, suggesting instead that the ability to find depth in simplicity represents authentic spiritual maturity. Consider how this principle might apply to our approach to the mysteries of faith. Take, for example, the mystery of the Incarnation, God becoming human in Jesus. We might approach this mystery intellectually, reading theological explanations of hypostatic union or kenotic Christology. Such reading has value, helping us understand the conceptual framework within which the Church has interpreted this mystery. But Ignatius would invite us to go further, to contemplate the Incarnation through imaginative prayer, placing ourselves in the scene, perhaps as an unseen observer in Nazareth as the angel appears to Mary, or in Bethlehem as the child is born. We might notice the expressions on faces, the emotions present, the details of the surroundings. Through this contemplative engagement, the mystery moves from abstract concept to lived reality, from something we know about to something we experience. The Rosary facilitates precisely this kind of contemplative engagement with the mysteries of faith. As we touch each bead, speak each prayer, and imagine each scene, we create space for the mystery to touch us in return. This mutual touching represents what Ignatius understood as the essence of prayer. Not primarily us speaking to God or even God speaking to us, but God communicating God's self to us, a direct sharing of divine life that transforms us from within. This communication happens not primarily through concepts, but through presence, not through explanation, but through encounter. The Rosary, in its material simplicity and contemplative depth, creates conditions conducive to this transformative presence. This understanding of prayer as transformative presence rather than mere information exchange challenges how we often approach spiritual growth in contemporary culture. We frequently adopt what might be called a consumption model of spirituality, where growth happens by acquiring more spiritual insights, techniques, or experiences. We read more books, attend more retreats, learn more prayer methods, always adding to our spiritual repertoire. Ignatius offers a different model, what might be called a digestion model, where growth happens not by consuming more, but by more thoroughly assimilating what we've already received. The Rosary exemplifies this approach, inviting us to return repeatedly to the same mysteries, allowing them to sink deeper into our consciousness over time, transforming us gradually through sustained engagement rather than novel experience. This digestive approach to spiritual growth connects to the Ignatian principle of repetition in prayer. In the spiritual exercises, Ignatius regularly instructs the retreatant to repeat previous meditations, returning to moments that evoked strong spiritual responses, either consolation or desolation. This repetition allows for deeper engagement, noticing aspects missed in the first encounter, allowing insights to mature and deepen. The Rosary institutionalizes this principle of repetition, building it into the structure of the prayer itself. We return to the same mysteries day after day, week after week, year after year, not because we've failed to grasp them the first time, but because their depth can never be exhausted by a single encounter. Here, we touch on another contrast between the Rosary and many spiritual books. Books often present spiritual insights as content to be mastered, material to be understood, and then set aside as we move on to new learning. The Rosary presents the mysteries of faith as relationships to be entered, realities to be engaged repeatedly as they continue to reveal new dimensions of meaning. This distinction reflects what Ignatius understood as the difference between comprender and gustar, between comprehending spiritual truths intellectually and savoring them experientially. Both have value, but it is in the savoring that transformation most deeply occurs. How then might we approach the Rosary with this Ignatian sensibility, allowing it to become more than merely another spiritual practice, but a doorway to transformative encounter. First, we might bring to it what Ignatius called preparatory prayer, taking a moment before beginning to recognize God's presence and ask for the grace to pray with full attention and devotion. This simple step helps transition us from the distractions of daily life to the focused attention prayer requires. Second, we might apply the Ignatian practice of composition of place, using our imagination to set the scene of each mystery, creating a mental space within which to contemplate. Third, we could practice the application of the senses that Ignatius recommends, imaginatively seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching the reality of each mystery. Finally, we might conclude each rosary with what Ignatius called the colloquy, a direct conversation with Jesus, Mary, or God the Father, speaking heart to heart about what we've experienced in our contemplation. This Ignatian approach transforms the rosary from a potentially mechanical recitation of prayers into a deeply personal encounter with the mysteries of faith. The same transformation can happen with our approach to spiritual books when we bring to them these same contemplative practices. Rather than reading merely to acquire information, we might read as a form of prayer, pausing frequently to allow what we read to move from mind to heart, from concept to experience. We might practice spiritual reading as Ignatius taught it, reading a short passage then setting the book aside to consider how this truth connects to our own life, how it challenges or consoles us, how it reveals God's presence or invitation. In this way, spiritual reading becomes not an alternative to the rosary, but a complement to it, both serving as pathways to the transformative encounter that stands at the heart of Ignatian spirituality. The relationship between knowledge and experience in spiritual growth might be compared to the relationship between a map and a journey. Spiritual books provide maps, offering conceptual frameworks for understanding the spiritual territory, identifying landmarks, suggesting pathways, warning of dangers. The Rosary invites us on a journey, providing a way to traverse the territory ourselves, to experience its contours directly, to encounter its realities personally. Both map and journey have value. A journey without a map risks aimless wandering or dangerous detours. A map without a journey remains abstract, theoretical, untested by direct experience. The wisest approach integrates both, using the map to guide the journey while allowing the journey to correct and enrich our understanding of the map. Ignatius understood this integration through his own experience. His initial conversion through spiritual books quickly led him into direct experience through prayer, ascetical practices, and pilgrimage. These experiences in turn led him back to deeper study, eventually including formal theological education at the University of Paris. Throughout his life, knowledge and experience remained in dialogue, each informing and enriching the other. The spiritual exercises themselves represent the fruit of this integration, offering conceptual frameworks and methodological guidance while continually directing the retreatant toward personal experience of God's presence and action. The challenge for many of us in contemporary culture lies in restoring this integration where it has been lost. We often find ourselves with extensive spiritual maps but limited journey experience, knowing the terminology and theory of contemplative prayer while struggling to quiet our minds for 5 minutes of actual contemplation. The Rosary offers a simple but profound way to begin rebalancing this relationship, inviting us into direct experience without requiring us to abandon the valuable guidance that spiritual books provide. It offers a middle path between empty intellectualism on one hand and anti-intellectual spirituality on the other, maintaining the value of both understanding and experience while recognizing their proper relationship. This middle path reflects the broader middle path that characterizes Ignatian spirituality in many dimensions. Ignatius consistently sought integration rather than polarization, between contemplation and action, between personal prayer and liturgical worship, between individual discernment and communal obedience, between finding God in all things and recognizing the unique presence of God in sacred spaces and practices. This integrative approach contrasts sharply with tendencies in contemporary spirituality toward either-or thinking, where we feel compelled to choose between being knowledge-oriented or experience-oriented, intellectually engaged or emotionally expressive, traditionally grounded or innovatively responsive. Ignatius would invite us beyond these false dichotomies toward a both-and spirituality that embraces the full range of human capacity for knowing and loving God. The Rosary embodies this both-and quality beautifully. It is both ancient and ever new, both structured and flexible, both communal and personal, both repetitive and creative, both bodily and mental. It engages both our capacity for speech and our capacity for silence, both our ability to focus attention and our ability to open awareness. It honors both our need for familiar ritual and our desire for fresh encounter. In all these ways, it reflects the integrative genius that characterizes Ignatian spirituality at its best. The refusal to sacrifice one dimension of human experience for another, insisting instead that authentic spirituality engages the whole person in relationship with God. This holistic engagement connects to what Ignatius understood as the ultimate purpose of all spiritual practices, including both the Rosary and spiritual reading. Greater love of God expressing itself in more faithful service. For Ignatius, increased knowledge of spiritual things has value not in itself, but in how it facilitates deeper love and more effective service. Similarly, spiritual experiences have value not primarily for the consolation they provide, but for how they free us from self-centeredness and enable more generous response to God's call. This understanding provides a crucial criterion for evaluating the relative value of different spiritual practices in our lives. If extensive spiritual reading has increased our knowledge but not our love, something is missing in our approach. If regular prayer of the Rosary has created pleasant feelings but not greater generosity toward others, we've missed its deeper purpose. The ultimate measure lies not in what we know or what we feel, but in how we love. This criterion of love connects to a central theme in Marian spirituality that finds expression in the Rosary: Mary's fiat, her wholehearted yes to God's invitation. Each mystery of the Rosary, in its own way, illuminates some dimension of this fundamental receptivity to God's action, this cooperative response to divine initiative. As we pray the Rosary with Ignatian attentiveness, we not only contemplate Mary's fiat, but are invited into our own corresponding yes to whatever God asks of us. This yes goes beyond intellectual assent to conceptual truths. It involves the whole person, heart and mind, body and soul, in receptive response to God's self-gift. It transforms not just what we think about God, but how we live in relationship with God and others. In our often fragmented and distracted culture, where partial attention has become the norm, this call to wholehearted response presents a profound challenge. We have grown accustomed to dividing our attention, multitasking our way through life, giving percentages of our awareness to multiple simultaneous activities. We bring these same habits to our spiritual practices, reading spiritual books while mentally composing to-do lists, reciting prayers while emotionally elsewhere, physically present in worship while psychologically absent. The Rosary, engaged with Ignatian attention, calls us back to unification, to bringing our whole selves to our relationship with God, to being fully present to the present one. This unification itself constitutes a significant part of the healing and transformation that authentic spirituality offers. If these reflections on the power of the Rosary through the lens of Ignatian spirituality have touched something in your heart, I invite you to join our community of seekers trying to integrate knowledge and experience, understanding and love in our spiritual lives. Each week on this channel, we explore different dimensions of the Catholic spiritual tradition, always with attention to how ancient wisdom applies to contemporary challenges. We look at practices like the Rosary not as relics of a bygone era, but as time-tested pathways to the transformative encounter with God that we all seek. If that journey speaks to your own spiritual hunger, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. Your presence enriches our shared exploration, and together we can encourage each other toward that integration of head and heart that authentic spirituality requires. Thank you for spending this time in reflection with me today. Your willingness to engage these depths suggests that the Spirit is already at work within you, drawing you toward the fullness of life that God desires for each of us. The integration of the Rosary into daily life represents a practical application of another key Ignatian principle: finding God in all things. For Ignatius, God is not confined to explicitly religious activities or sacred spaces, but is actively present and working in every dimension of human experience. The challenge lies not in bringing God into our lives, but in becoming aware of the God already present. The Rosary, carried in pocket or purse, wrapped around wrist or rearview mirror, serves as a tangible reminder of this divine presence, a physical prompt to awareness in the midst of everyday activities. When we touch these beads while waiting in line, sitting in traffic, or walking between appointments, we create what might be called sacramental moments, where physical reality becomes a doorway to spiritual awareness. This practical integration, addresses one of the most common challenges in contemporary spiritual life: the compartmentalization of faith. Many of us struggle with what feels like two separate lives: our religious activities and our ordinary responsibilities, with little meaningful connection between them. We attend church or say prayers, then return to work, family responsibilities, and social engagements, with these domains feeling largely unrelated. The Rosary can help bridge this gap, not only through its physical presence throughout our day, but through how the mysteries we contemplate illuminate the ordinary experiences of life. The mystery of the Annunciation speaks to moments of decision and vocational call in our own lives. The Visitation connects to our service of others and building of community. The Nativity relates to experiences of new beginning and vulnerable hope. Each mystery provides a lens through which to view and interpret our ordinary experiences in light of God's ongoing action in the world. This interpretive function reveals another way that the Rosary and spiritual books can work in complementary rather than competitive ways. Spiritual books offer conceptual frameworks that help us understand and organize our experience, providing language and categories for discerning God's action in our lives. The Rosary offers narrative frameworks that help us connect our personal stories to the larger story of salvation, locating our individual experiences within the broader patterns of God's relationship with humanity. Both frameworks have value, offering different but complementary ways of finding meaning and purpose in our lived experience. The problem arises not from having both, but from failing to integrate them, from allowing our conceptual understanding to become detached from narrative embodiment or our narrative imagination to operate without conceptual clarity. Ignatius himself models this integration beautifully in his autobiography, which he dictated late in life. The work combines rich narrative of his experiences with clear conceptual understanding of spiritual principles, showing how each informed the other in his development. He describes his early conversion, when he noticed different interior reactions to daydreams about chivalric exploits versus thoughts about imitating the saints. This experience led to his conceptual understanding of discernment of spirits, recognizing how different thoughts and impulses produce distinct emotional and spiritual effects that can be discerned. This understanding in turn guided his further experiences, helping him navigate complex decisions and spiritual struggles. Throughout his life, narrative and concept remained in continuous dialogue, each enriching and correcting the other. This dialogue between narrative and concept, between experience and understanding, mirrors the dialogue between the Rosary and spiritual books in a well-integrated approach to faith. The Rosary engages us in the narrative of salvation through imaginative contemplation of its key moments. Spiritual books engage us in conceptual understanding of theological principles and spiritual dynamics. When these function in dialogue rather than isolation, they create a richer and more transformative spirituality than either could produce alone. The narrative engagement keeps conceptual understanding from becoming abstract and detached. The conceptual clarity helps narrative engagement avoid becoming merely subjective or sentimental. Together, they facilitate the kind of integrated knowing that Ignatius recognized as authentic spiritual wisdom. This integrated knowing differs significantly from how knowledge is often understood in contemporary culture, where it's frequently reduced to information possession or technical expertise. In the Ignatian understanding, authentic knowing always involves relationship, always includes love. To truly know God means to love God, to be in right relationship with God. This understanding reconfigures how we approach both the Rosary and spiritual books, inviting us to see both as means of deepening relationship rather than merely acquiring information or having experiences. The question becomes not whether we've intellectually grasped the theological significance of the Incarnation or emotionally connected with the nativity scene, but whether our relationship with God has deepened through our engagement, whether our capacity to recognize and respond to God's presence has increased. This relational understanding connects to what Ignatius described as the three primary faculties of the soul that spiritual practices should engage: memory, understanding, and will. Memory reconnects us to our personal and communal history of relationship with God, helping us recognize patterns of divine fidelity and human response over time. Understanding helps us comprehend the meaning and significance of this relationship, its implications for how we live. Will enables us to respond in love, to say yes to God's invitation to deeper communion and broader service. The Rosary engages all three faculties, memory through its connection to the biblical narrative and the tradition of faith, understanding through contemplation of each mystery's significance, will through the decision to pray attentively and respond to whatever grace or invitation emerges. Spiritual books similarly engage all three when approached properly, connecting us to our spiritual heritage, deepening our comprehension of its meaning, and inviting response through applied insight. The engaging of all three faculties reflects what Ignatius understood as the proper use of created things in service of our ultimate end, to praise, reverence, and serve God. Both the Rosary and spiritual books are created things, tools meant to facilitate our relationship with God. Their proper use involves neither attachment nor rejection, but rather intentional engagement oriented toward deeper communion. We use them insofar as they help us toward this end and free ourselves from them insofar as they hinder us. This balanced approach avoids both the dismissal of traditional practices like the Rosary as outdated or superstitious and the elevation of such practices to ends in themselves. It maintains what Ignatius called appropriate reverence for spiritual tools, while keeping our primary focus on the relationship these tools are meant to serve. This principle of appropriate use applies not just to the choice between the Rosary and spiritual books, but to how we approach each of them. The Rosary can be prayed mechanically, as a kind of spiritual busy work, or contemplatively, as a pathway to encounter. Spiritual books can be read superficially, as a way to accumulate information, or reflectively, as invitation to transformation. The difference lies not in the tools themselves, but in our intention and attention as we use them. This reminds us that the power of any spiritual practice ultimately depends not on the practice itself, but on how it facilitates our openness to God's transformative presence. The most venerable tradition, empty of this intention, becomes merely religious routine. The simplest practice infused with genuine openness becomes a channel of grace. Ignatius, who experienced firsthand the transformative power of both spiritual reading and contemplative prayer, would encourage us to approach both the Rosary and spiritual books with this fundamental openness, this readiness to let God work in and through our engagement. This openness itself constitutes what he would call a grace, a gift we receive rather than an achievement we attain. We can dispose ourselves toward this grace through practices like the Rosary and spiritual reading, but the grace itself comes from God, who is always already reaching toward us in love. Our spiritual practices, at their best, simply help us recognize and respond to this divine initiative, this prevenient grace that precedes all our seeking. In this recognition, we touch the heart of what makes the Rosary powerful from an Ignatian perspective. Its power lies not in the beads themselves, or even in the prayers we say, but in how it disposes us toward receptivity to God's self-communication. The repetitive prayers, the physical movement from bead to bead, the imaginative contemplation of each mystery, all work together to quiet our restless minds and open our distracted hearts to a presence always offered but often unnoticed. This receptivity allows God's transformative love to work within us, gradually conforming us to the image of Christ, who represents perfect humanity in perfect relationship with God. This conforming constitutes the ultimate purpose of all spiritual practices in the Ignatian understanding, the goal toward which both the Rosary and spiritual books, properly used, lead us. As we draw this exploration to a close, we return to our opening question. Why might the Rosary in your hands be more powerful than any spiritual book, according to Ignatius of Loyola? The answer lies not in dismissing the value of spiritual reading, but in recognizing what the Rosary, prayed with Ignatian attention, uniquely facilitates: an integrated engagement of the whole person in receptive response to God's presence. The Rosary engages our bodies through the physical handling of the beads, our minds through contemplation of each mystery, our imaginations through entering the gospel scenes, our emotions through connecting with the joys and sorrows of Jesus and Mary, and our wills through the decision to pray attentively despite distraction. This holistic engagement creates optimal conditions for the transformative encounter that stands at the heart of authentic spirituality. Spiritual books, for all their value in providing conceptual understanding and theological guidance, often engage primarily our intellects, leaving other dimensions of our humanity less directly involved. The Rosary invites a more complete participation of the whole person in the act of prayer. This fuller engagement reflects the incarnational principle at the heart of Catholic spirituality, that God reaches us not only through concepts and ideas, but through physical reality, not only through the abstract, but through the concrete. Just as God became human in Jesus, taking on physical flesh to communicate divine love, so the Rosary takes the physical form of beads and embodied prayer to facilitate our receptivity to this love. This incarnational quality gives the Rosary a unique power as a spiritual practice, a power that complements rather than competes with the more conceptual understanding that spiritual books provide. The Rosary, then, stands as a profound embodiment of Ignatian spirituality's central insights: that God can be found in all things, that prayer engages the whole person, that imagination serves as a pathway to encounter, that repetition deepens rather than diminishes experience, and that the ultimate measure of any spiritual practice lies in how it increases our capacity to love God and serve others. When approached with the kind of attention and intention that Ignatius taught, this simple circle of beads becomes a powerful pathway to the transformative presence we all seek. A presence that both spiritual books and the Rosary, in their distinct but complementary ways, help us recognize and receive. May your own engagement with both deepen your capacity to find God in all things and respond with the wholehearted yes that Mary models and the Rosary helps us practice.